benedicta tu in mulier.
Hello and welcome to Historia Ecclesiastica. My name is Daniel Sudi, and in this video we are going to talk about how you or a loved one can keep their faith in a secular university. Let us begin with a prayer, prayed on the feast day of St. John Henry Newman, the patron saint of Newman Centers, which are young adult Catholic centers in secular universities. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. O God, who bestowed on the priest St. John Henry Newman the grace to follow your kindly light and find peace in your church, graciously grant that through his intercession and example we may be led out of shadows and images into the fullness of your truth. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Okay, if you could please like, comment, share, and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it. And let's get right to it. Imagine you lived in a society in which a ruling ideology had become so entrenched and institutionalized in the elite levels of that society, it was required that any teens who desired to participate anywhere near the upper classes of that society economically had to agree to be sent away to a fully immersive indoctrination institution which would gobble up 4 to 6 years of their life, indoctrinating them in the ruling ideology, even if the career that they sought had little to do with the tenets of that ideology. A provocative, imaginative question. And it probably draws to mind the Uyghur re-education camps in China, where the Muslims living in the western mountains of China are sent to indoctrination camps if they're revealed to be practicing Muslims. It probably calls to mind the Vietnamese re-education bamboo gulags, where people were imprisoned and indoctrinated in communist tenets. We can think about the re-education camps which the Nazis had, which were more, just variations of work camps and in which many people died. And then we can think about the less violent but more effective re-education camps in our own Western society today, the secular university. Is it a bit hyperbolic to say that universities are indoctrination camps? I'm sure many people would balk at that idea, but let me provide just a few thought experiments to kind of address that question of whether or not universities have sadly today become indoctrination facilities rather than places where truth is purely sought. First of all, the word indoctrination obviously has a very negative connotation. I am an indoctrinator. I am teaching church doctrines in this YouTube channel, and as a catechism teacher, I teach church doctrines. So obviously indoctrination has a negative connotation today, and that's because a lot of people are indoctrinating but claiming they're not. That would be like public educators who are teaching doctrines, but really they should just be teaching math, for example. The word indoctrination implies simply, though, an instruction in doctrine. And as we'll see in this video, today universities certainly operate under atheistic, dogmatic assumptions. Even if particular professors might have some sort of belief in God, they are still operating under very prevalent atheistic dogmas, or else they would not be able to function in the university as it exists today. For example, imagine if you took a World War II course and you were an undergrad student and you were assigned a very open-ended term paper to write about the causes of the war. Imagine if you wrote your term paper about how World War II was a punishment sent by God upon Western civilization as a result of the centuries of blasphemies against the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And in writing such a paper, you wouldn't have denied the political causes of World War II or the cultural causes or even the economic causes. But let's say you just decided to emphasize that perspective, that angle, that there was a divine cause, that there was a heavenly cause for the war, that it was a sort of punishment upon the West. How do you think any professor at a secular university would react to that? How do you even think history professors at a Christian university would react to that if that was the angle you took in writing this history paper? Now imagine a psychology student who had to write about the root cause of suicidality. And imagine if a psychology student were to write a paper analyzing the correlation between the increasing normalcy of sin in the West and the increasing suicidation rates in the West. How would most psychology professors react to that? If someone were to suggest that living a life of sin opens the soul to the demonic, which makes suicide more and more attractive once one's soul has been infested with the demonic. Neither of these essays would be accepted, and I have even anecdotes from my own life and from friends' lives where angles were taken in papers that were just a little bit open to theism, not nearly as prevalent as either of those theses would have been, and they were utterly rejected and received poor grades just because they were a little bit open to theism. It's absolutely unacceptable in the university today to have any openness to God being a factor in any of these disciplines. And the opposite side of the coin, imagine how the same professors would have reacted to receiving a term paper which perhaps argued that Christianity was inherently, anti-Semitic. If someone had made that argument and thus said that Germany's Christian roots caused World War II, or at least the Holocaust, professors wouldn't have a problem with that. Professors also certainly wouldn't have a problem if a psychology student argued that the sexual repression, quote unquote, of traditional Christian ethics was the root cause of suicidal tendencies in young people today. That's absurd, but if that thesis were to be made in the university, it would probably get a good grade because it's very in line with the dogmas of the secular university today. The idea that God, who is believed by Christians, at least in theory, to be the all-powerful author of life and the ever-present guide of all creation, the idea that God would have any tangible influence over history, science, psychology, ethics, psychology, or any other discipline, that idea is absolutely anathema in virtually all universities, certainly in secular universities, but sadly in many, if not most, Christian universities as well. Explicitly or implicitly, the university assumes an atheistic worldview and forbids any of its scholars, students, or professors from ever integrating Christian doctrines which contradict that worldview into their teaching, their papers, or their studies. In this video, we are going to look at the history of the university, and we're going to look at the idea of the university, and we will express in this video, I'm sure, an appreciation all of us have for the ideal university. What it could be is so attractive. Then we'll talk about the fall of the university in the West. We will talk about the reality of the university today with its atheistic foundations. And then finally, we will talk about some practical steps for maintaining one's Catholic faith in the university, or even Christian faith as well. If anybody's viewing who is not a Catholic, I think you'll find the ideas here to be equally as strong. But convert. Part 1. The idea of the university. Now, that's the title of this section here. It's also the title of a book by St. John Henry Newman, where he expresses his own love of the university and expresses what he believes the university should be and could be. And it's not a long read. It's worth reading. The concept of a university has a tremendous appeal to Christians and non-Christians alike. If you see this image off here to the right and something about it excites you, I think you're a person who loves the idea of the university. Defined in its purest sense, the university is a massively well-funded institution which is entirely dedicated to the pursuit of truth. Consider the sacrifices needed to make one university possible. If you're paying a mortgage on a 1,000-square-foot house, just imagine the funds you pay monthly and imagine the funds necessary to run an entire university filled with, let's say, 20 buildings that are each 20 times bigger than your house, with the full-time faculty needed, with janitorial staff needed, with the bureaucracy required. It's all the maintaining the library and, it's just a massive, massive operation. Really unparalleled. I can't think of another operation, another institution that's quite as massive as a single secular university is. Just you're housing thousands and thousands and thousands of young people, and you're feeding them, and you're providing them with water and electricity, and on top of all that, you're educating them as well, or at least theoretically, you're educating them. Any lover of knowledge and truth is drawn towards the idea of spending time in the university, at least several years of their life, in order to devote several years of their life to the study of the masters of the various academic disciplines and to the pursuit of answering the big questions of the universe and of life. As we shall see, however, sadly, a rigid and extremely narrow atheistic orthodoxy has morphed the university into a sad shadow, if not the direct opposite, of these ideals. So let's look at how the university started in order to appreciate it even more, but also to appreciate how tragic its fall is and will continue to be for the West. How did universities originate? So most historians would agree that the university as we know it today did originate in the West. There were societies of intellectuals that were kind of similar to the university in the Middle East even before the European Renaissance. However, at the same time, the modern university, which is popular throughout the entire world today, certainly has its origins in the Western university model. Universities sprang out of the rich philosophical tradition of early medieval European, or we could say Roman, if you've been following the videos here, society. This intellectual philosophical tradition was, of course, philosophy in general is typically dated back in the West to the schools of Athens. But the schools of philosophy which would directly lay the foundations for the European university were the philosophical works nourished by the monasteries and the bishops of the patristic period of the Catholic Church. Even during the dark ages of the Viking raids and the political institutional collapses following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as well as the climate disasters of the 5th and 6th centuries, this rich philosophical tradition continued and thrived in medieval Christian monasteries. Not only monasteries, but cathedrals as well regularly provided both elementary grammar schools as well as schools of higher learning for those who were going into careers of not only religion as priests, but also the higher education that was provided by monasteries and cathedrals was also extended towards those who were going into a career in statecraft. So we can't really say that this sort of public grammar education for youths and then this higher education in the classics, the classic philosophers, the classic texts, the classic literature, and, traditional theology. That higher education, and as well as the grammar education, it wasn't extended publicly to all people. Peasants were not able to really participate in this. But basically, monks did provide this education to those who were able to participate because of their social and their social status in the hierarchy of Western civilization during the medieval period. Monasteries, of course, are associations of monks who are united and living a solitary life in common to worship and sacrifice to God. They provided education. Cathedrals did as well. Cathedrals were the church of bishops, for those who are not aware. Basically, the church in which a bishop resides is called a cathedral. And the clerics who lived there and sung the hours and also performed education, those were called canons. Canons are the priests who lived in the cathedral. So that's a term that still exists in the Catholic Church today, but it doesn't really have the traditional role that it used to have. Now, medieval guilds would form in growing urban areas in the early second millennium to provide stability and communal support to members of the same trade. So these guilds would form between, let's say, fellow blacksmiths, fellow carpenters, bakers, whatever. There would masons would form guilds in order to allow people who all practice the same trade to look after one another, to perform burials for one another, to perform a sort of life insurance for one another if they had died. And during this same time period, master scholars and associated students began to form scholarly guilds, which were referred to as universities. University was actually the Latin word for a guild, but it remains today for this particular type of guild, which united scholars and students. These universities were given charters by noblemen or princes who funded their philosophical pursuits. So universities were the first time in which lay people began to form basically associations of scholars and students who wanted to simply study the great questions together and discuss them and debate on them and come to greater truth and understanding. And so this is the first time that there is a secular university, which is a university which is not an extension of a religious monastery or cathedral. These universities, at the same time, frequently grew out from local monastic or cathedral schools. So there were times when these pre-existing schools would develop into a university. So there was always an association between the church and the university, and there was certainly always an intellectual association. So these very early universities would have been step for step with the monastery schools and the cathedral schools when it came to what doctrines were taught, as theology was the queen of the disciplines. At times, however, these secular universities developed independent of pre-existing institutions. Notable monastic universities were instituted, or not universities, but schools in general, were instituted by Saint Pachomius, who lived from around the year 320 to 340. Saint Basil also established schools between 330 and 380 AD, thereabouts. And they both lived in the east and in the west. The monasteries of Saint Martin at Leguig founded a school in around the year 361 AD, and Saint Honorat of Lorraine did the same. While economic hardships caused these early schools to decline in the West after the 5th century, Charlemagne, who brought a great renaissance to Western civilization and reestablished the Holy Roman Empire, oversaw a renaissance in literacy and education in his empire. So he greatly encouraged study, and he helped lay the foundation for the later Western university. The oldest university, which was not directly overseen by a clerical establishment, which is still in existence today, is the University of Bologna, founded in 1088 AD. Even though this was founded independently of a cathedral school or a monastery school, it did depend upon ecclesial legitimization by a papal bull. So the Pope had to authorize this association of scholars and students because the pursuit of truth is something that is under the guidance and authority of the church. And so no university was legitimate if it was not authorized by the church. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge were both formed around the year 1210 AD. The University of Paris was formed around the year 1180 AD, and it received its formal recognition in 1200 AD. In each of these universities, as I've mentioned, theology was queen, and philosophy was the chief steward of all learning. If one did not understand the theological dogmas upon which all truth is based, and if one did not have a good use of philosophy, their ability to study any other natural science or discipline was going to be flawed from the outset and would drift into error inevitably. So all the natural sciences developed in the Western University within the metaphysical worldview of divine revelation and was guided by the philosophical system first formed in Athens and refined by the Church Fathers, flowering into Western scholasticism during the time of the rise of the medieval university. We could say that the peak of the university was around the 13th century. In the 13th century, the Dominican order formed under the guidance of Saint Dominic, who was hoping to train highly educated clerics who would be capable of refuting the errors of the Cathares, a neo-Gnostic sect in that time period. And so he formed the Dominican order. It was a form of consecrated life which made full use of the university as a way to pursue God, who is truth, in order to save souls. Notably, Saints Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas were Dominican scholastics who taught at the University of Paris. St. Albert the Great was St. Thomas Aquinas' teacher. Later, in the 16th century, the Society of the Jesuits made full use of the university to gain the skills not only to refute Protestantism, but to shape Western society upon the foundation of divine revelation. Perhaps the fatal flaw with the Jesuit order, while not every Jesuit is objectionable, there are good Jesuits, as is often said, but obviously, the Jesuit order has many, many heretical issues today. And the fatal flaw of the Jesuit order was that it did not guide the university in the West enough. It sought to be a part of the university, to make full use of the university, and unfortunately was unable to distinguish between divine truth and the direction that universities would go shortly after the 16th century in the West. And so they should have been the guardians and leaders of the university, and perhaps some were, but in general, the Jesuits would sink with the Western University. Very, very few of them would be willing to abandon ship when the Western University began to sink. And they could have formed their own, and there are so much, maybe they still could. There are so many Jesuit universities. Maybe, God willing, many, many good men will infiltrate the Jesuit order and bring it back in obedience to holy tradition. So that leads us into part 2, the fall of the university. Before I get into that, though, I just wanted to mention one other thing I forgot to write here, is that the church has, since the Council of Trent, used the university structure to educate clerics. And so, the idea of seminaries, which are basically, it's the same exact structure as a university. Seminarians basically, they earn a master's degree in divinity in order to become masters of theology. And so the church has made full use of the university model. And it's not the way it always was. People used to be ordained simply at the discretion of the bishop, and there would have been very irregular practices for training clerics and educating them. So the university was able to standardize the training of clerics. So the university, once again, is a great idea. But that leads us into part 2, the fall of the university, which the seeds of the fall of the university date back shortly after its origin. Beginning with the Renaissance of the 14th century, Western scholarship began to consider unconventional means of attaining truth. While most societies depended upon the directly transmitted tradition, Western scholars began to look beyond the directly transmitted tradition to rediscover ancient classical sources. So, in other words, a good example of this is the Talmud, the tradition of medieval Jewish rabbis, where they would have the scripture in the center of a page, and then there would be a ring around the scripture that would be early rabbis commenting on it, and then there would be another ring around that where later rabbis would comment on it, on the earlier rabbis' commentary, and then the web of kind of this, the commentary would continue to expand upon the commentary which came directly before it. So that's the directly transmitted tradition. People didn't, in any society of the world, up until recently, and in the West up until the Renaissance, people used to look at the experts and the masters who came directly before them to find truth, and then they would expand upon the foundations that were handed to them directly. And that's good. There are also benefits to using other methods of finding truth than just looking at the directly transmitted tradition. And so Western scholars began to look beyond this directly transmitted tradition, and many of them began to rediscover ancient classical sources, especially Aristotle. Aristotle became wildly popular in the West after actually copies of his works were brought to the West, written in Arabic, and they were translated back into Hebrew, and back into Latin, to be read by Western scholars. So anyways, the Renaissance is basically re-looking back at classical sources, but also using a variety of other means to discover truth besides simply looking at the directly transmitted tradition. Inspired by these classical works, European scholars began to embrace humanistic styles of thought, which were popular in ancient Greece, placing value on the study of the human person and seeking a greater and greater space between theology and the natural sciences. So theology is still the queen of the sciences at first, but other disciplines are more and more emphasized, and that in and of itself is not bad, to be able to look at science purely in empirical, using empirical means. Not always looking for a theological interpretation of natural phenomenon is not bad, but this is going to begin a trend towards more and more trying to shelf theology and separate it from the disciplines, even to the point where we are today, where theology has no place in any of the disciplines except for theology, which is obviously too far to anyone who believes that God is living and moving in our world today. Humanism and the Renaissance reinforced the developing notion that scholars, even in theology, needed to master secular crafts of attaining truth, but did not necessarily need to be saints. This point is raised numerous times in Timothy Flanders' Introduction to the Holy Bible for Traditional Catholics. He says that the West once understood that theology was the queen of the sciences, and also, and more importantly, that the true theologian was, quote, the man who prays. The Western University began to fall from its exalted place in Western society once the scholar, even of theology, began to be a man who studied rather than one who prayed, and especially one who studied using secular methods apart from mystical experiences and the holiness of life. There is a connection between a holy soul and a wise soul, and one who's able to perceive truth. There also is factually the reality that one who sins dims their intellect, and so one who lives a sinful life is less capable of perceiving truth. And so even a scholar of biology is going to be better if they are holy. Martin Luther is the prime example of a theologian who is not a saint. He is not claimed to be a saint by any Lutherans. He's talked about a lot. He's celebrated for starting their sect, but he is not a saint. Martin Luther was a humanist theologian, rather. He used natural reason in order to come up with his own systematic theology, which was extremely different from the traditional Catholic means of understanding soteriology, which is the theology of salvation, and also the theology of how we derive divine revelation. So he came up with his own systems of soteriology by faith alone, and his own systems of understanding divine revelation, scripture alone, as well as a variety of other errors, which he was able to come up with through his own human methods rather than through mystical experience. The Renaissance and humanism questioned the directly received tradition. This skepticism allowed the Christian university, which was still obedient to divine revelation, to flourish to its zenith in the 12th through 13th centuries. Because being able to question the directly received tradition, but still being faithful to the Catholic Church's dogmas, and still recognizing theology as the queen of the disciplines, that's a good combination. Having a healthy degree of skepticism while also having a healthy obedience to the church is going to make you a wise intellectual and scholar. However, things started to go very haywire as Protestantism questioned Catholic tradition in general. Following the tradition of the Renaissance and humanism, Protestantism continued to use secular methods in order to analyze church tradition in general and analyze and critique divine revelation in general. Later, Descartes, who was a practicing Catholic and never died outside of the grace of the church, questioned our ability to know anything with certainty besides our awareness of subjective thought. He was unable to find any evidence that what we perceive as true is actually true, because all we know is that we are perceiving it, and we do not know how accurate our sensory organs or faculties are. Descartes questioning how we can even know anything to be real at all is going to continue to send Western philosophy into a cyclone of doubt. Not long after Descartes, Enlightenment philosophers began to question Christianity in general, and even theism in general. The explosive popularity of the Enlightenment amongst 18th and 19th century Western scholars would ultimately lead to a new dogmatic and rigid orthodoxy of atheism, at least implied atheism, and the utter dismissal of divine revelation in academic studies. How did the church respond to the Enlightenment? I'll read just a few quotes here of how popes responded to these trends in university life. These popes lived in the 19th century, and we can see them responding in real time to the tragic fall of the university, which was once a beautiful institution of the church, legitimized by the church to lead souls to God, who is truth. But by the 19th century, the universities did the exact opposite effect. They led the march of Western civilization away from God, off the cliff of rationality, because it's completely irrational to believe there is this universe with no cause. And it's very irrational to think that God would have no effect on the universe. So the university of the 19th century begins to lead the West off the cliff of rationalism into the abyss of atheism. And these are how the popes respond. Pope Pius VIII says, "My sadness is due to the numberless errors and the teachings of perverse doctrines, which no longer secretly and clandestinely, but openly and vigorously attack the Catholic faith. You know how evil men have raised the standard of revolt against religion through philosophy, of which they proclaim themselves doctors, and through empty fallacies devised according to natural reason. Pope Gregory XVI said, "Academies and schools resound with new, monstrous opinions, which openly attack the Catholic faith. This horrible and nefarious war is openly and even publicly waged. Thus, by institutions and by the example of teachers, the minds of the youth are corrupted, and a tremendous blow is dealt to religion, and the perversion of morals is spread." So right here, Pope Gregory XVI recognizes the effectiveness of the university in reforming society. He says that these institutions and the example of these teachers corrupts the minds of the youth and blow a tremendous blow to religion and morals in general. That's recognized by the popes. It's also recognized by organizations such as the Freemasons, a pragmatically, a syncretic religious cult which sought to basically enshrine the Enlightenment in the institutions of the West. The Freemasons recognized the effectiveness of the university in accomplishing their goals. And so it's extremely reasonable that this organization, which met secretly and certainly schemed to implement their vision for Western society, would have infiltrated universities in order to implement that vision. It's also very reasonable that later ideologies, which sought to reform all of Western civilization, would have also infiltrated universities in order to accomplish their goals, and organizations such as ideologies such as communism would have made use of this tactic as well. They would have certainly sought to infiltrate universities in order to advance their vision for society. And, as Christians, Jesus said we must be as wise as serpents, as innocent as doves. The university is the place where society is the most directly affected. If you wonder why, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but if you wonder why Hollywood is more interested with indoctrination than entertainment, if you're wondering why many public school teachers, and sadly perhaps many Catholic school teachers, are more interested in indoctrination and spreading the ideology than even teaching math or science, and if you're wondering why even the ads you see, for Bud Light, for example, are more interested with spreading an ideology than they are with simply marketing their products, it's because people who got marketing degrees, people who got education degrees, and people who got, creative writing degrees at universities, they were all trained in institutions which were promoting ideology over content. And so the idea of the university, for many, many universities, many, many professors, the idea is to basically not only indoctrinate, but create activists. Many people are trained to be activists more than they are to be trained in their careers. And so we, back to my original point here, as Christians who believe that society should be consecrated to God because all things should be consecrated to the God who created them, perhaps we should pay attention to the university and even perhaps seek careers in the university. Obviously, you have to be very careful doing so, but just being a presence in the university who can point the direction back to God, even just nudging students back to God, that can make a huge difference. And I know I had professors like that, like needles in a haystack were those professors, but they made a big difference for me. Finally, Blessed Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors condemned the notion that, quote, human reason without any reference whatsoever to God is the sole arbiter of truth and falsehood and of good and evil. It is a law to itself and suffices by its natural force to secure the welfare of men and of nations, end quote. In other words, it's absurd to say that human reason alone, without any reference to God whatsoever, could possibly discover truth or good and evil. So ethics and truth need to have a dialogue with theology. The Enlightenment laid the atheistic groundwork of extreme skepticism which the modern university would be built upon. It would be this system of thought which provided us with modern liberalism and the radically secular approach to disciplines such as history, psychology, geopolitics, and Marxism. Even theology programs in many Christian universities would bow down to these trends in secularization. in the university. In this new model of the university, theology was not only dethroned as queen, it was cast out of the university and humiliated. Recourse to divine revelation was deemed anathema by all of the disciplines. Even worse than this, increasing numbers of theologians in new Christian institutions, even in seminaries, even though it was much more difficult to be openly liberal in the turn of the 20th century, it wasn't as difficult in mainstream Protestant seminaries, and that's why today mainline Protestant denominations are so liberal, because the theologians who worked in mainline Protestant seminaries in the first half of the 20th century began to merge theology with the secular methodologies which were built upon atheistic foundations. The same trends were happening in Catholic scholarship, but it was much more discreet until Vatican II, and then it came out of the woodworks. You could see all the roaches crawling out of the woodworks after Vatican II with how corrupted many Catholic theologians had become. Trying to integrate theology with atheism, basically, it's absolutely absurd. This was more open in Protestant seminaries, and this is why mainline Protestant churches are just so progressive today. And the only Protestant churches which aren't are those which never really relied that much on seminaries, but relied a lot more on charismatic preaching. Okay, these trends of the secularization, even of theology in Christian institutions, allowed the historical critical method, which doubts everything of tradition and implies that basically what is in the scriptures or what is in church tradition are merely historical documents which should be critiqued and analyzed rather than received as treasures, and other liberal academic traditions to shed doubt on every area of divine revelation. And if you want proof of that, open up a New American Bible, read the commentary. The commentary in the New American Bible is abhorrent, very atheistic, sheds doubts on almost everything you can imagine as being essential dogmas of our faith. The New American Bible commentary pokes doubt at everything. And my book, also, The Missal of St. Paul VI, The Complete History of the Novus Ordo, there's a whole chapter chronicling the fall of Western theology. So you can check that out as well. It's an ebook. It's on Amazon. Even Catholic universities would, fall under these trends. In 1967, the International Federation of Catholic Universities released the Land O'Lakes Statement, which was subtitled The Idea of a Catholic University. This conference was led by Father Theodore Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame, and was also led by Father Theodore McCarrick of unhappy reputation, as you know from the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report. This document opens up saying, to perform its teaching and research functions effectively, the Catholic University must have a true autonomy and academic freedom in the face of authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical, external to the academic community itself. To say this is simply to assert that institutional autonomy and academic freedom are essential conditions of life and growth and indeed of survival for Catholic universities as for all universities, end quote. So the document opens by saying, hey, the Catholic University must be independent from the judgment of church authority. We cannot pursue truth if we are afraid of being labeled heretics. They are arguing that heresy must be considered in bounds for our intellectuals in order for us to pursue truth, which is implying heresies might be true. So the dogmas of the church might be false, and we must be free to pursue either one. So this statement has an implied belief that the church's means of determining truth are flawed, and therefore they're useless. And the university is better at pursuing truth than the guardians of truth that God established, which is the magisterium of the Catholic Church. So I say all that to say that, unfortunately, even many, if not most, Catholic universities are not all that better from secular ones. The only difference would be that at a Catholic university, you're more likely to find a professor who believes in God, and that sort of belief might influence their scholarship. It might be something they put on a shelf and don't really let affect their scholarship, though. They might have a dual personality as a professor. So Catholic universities are probably a little bit better. Notre Dame's probably a little bit better than University of Indiana, but it still has issues. You still need to be very watchful if you go to a secular university. Finally, as we mentioned before, the Comintern was an organization founded by the Soviet Union in 1919. And it was basically their institution, which they had created in order to infiltrate influential institutions in non communist Western nations, especially universities. So the Soviet Union greatly funded the Comintern in order to infiltrate institutions in other nations. They openly said, we hope that all, and we're working on causing communist revolutions in all nations of the world, including those of the United States and Western Europe. The Marxist ideology of a great deal of professors today is hardly veiled, if veiled at all. Let's look at the state of the university today. The modern university, particularly the liberal arts, has been, as we've said, reestablished off of the foundations of Catholic divine revelation and reestablished upon the foundations of the atheistic Enlightenment. The assumption that one can never assert a dogma of divine revelation as an axiom is taken for granted in all secular universities and even in most Christian ones. We talked about that at the beginning, about how you could never write a term paper about the causes of World War II being divine punishment for sins. What's more, teachings which are contrary to the faith and biology and natural reason regarding gender, marriage, family life, sexuality, prenatal life, ethics in general, and theology, which is taught in the atheistic lens, are taught dogmatically. So it will be assumed that you will agree that gender is not concrete, it's not static, it's not binding, it's not binary. It will be taught concretely that marriage is not between a man and a woman, with the prerequisite being open to life. It'll be assumed that, the nuclear family is simply one form of family, and it's not even a preferable one. It will be assumed that sexuality is merely a itch or urge which must be exercised, or else, you'll have psychological harm. It will be assumed in the university that unborn children are not human or not worthy of human rights. It will be assumed that situation ethics is true. There is no natural law. It will be assumed that there are no such things as intrinsic evils. And it will be assumed that theology, the only theology you can operate under as a student of a secular university, is theology which states that there is nothing, or if there is something that created us, it has no influence over us today. Gender theory in particular, as a sort of supernatural anthropology, and I say supernatural because it teaches that gender is something beyond nature. Gender is something that is intensely spiritual and has no correlation to the body. This is taught as an official sort of religion in the university, where you could argue that sort of like the form of consecrated life of the gender theory religion is one who actually transitions. It's similar in the ceremonies around it and the celebration that people who transition receive by people who subscribe to that ideology. It's sort of like the way that Catholics would respond to knowing somebody that became a monk or a nun. They all believe it, but the ones that actually physically do that to their bodies, they're offering kind of the ultimate sacrifice to this ideology, and that's why it's celebrated so much. Furthermore, no student of the modern university can attain a degree without encountering professors who are going to be explicitly hostile towards Catholicism. The modern university is then the source engine and greatest vehicle of atheistic liberalism. It also is essentially a prerequisite for participation in the upper classes of Western economic life. Thus, most Westerners must attain a degree from one of these institutions in order to fully engage in Western economic life. Approximately 40% of college professors were atheists or agnostics. According to a Harvard study in 2007, this has of course gone up since then. In 2014, 60% of college professors have identified as liberal. That has also gone up since then, I'm sure. 70% of college graduates who entered university as practicing Christians would leave with little or no faith, and 10% who remained Christian would leave university declaring themselves as being disengaged from their faith. In other words, if you go to university as a fully practicing Christian, you have a 20% chance of graduating with your faith still intact. Another worrisome statistic is that approximately 80% of cradle Catholics in general would abandon their faith by the age of 23, many of them losing their faith in the university. That's implied by the fact that most people graduate college at the age of 23. These are firsthand stories from my own experience. or those of my family and friends. I have known someone who had a professor who wore a sickle and hammer jacket to class each week. I personally had a professor of Caribbean history who mocked Catholicism each and every lecture. And when I confronted him about this, he told me, quote, "You cannot be a Catholic and a good person at the same time." I also experienced being laughed at by an entire lecture hall. We were discussing the causes of struggling struggling family. We were discussing the struggles in urban areas. I went to school in Detroit for my undergrad, and I rose my hand when we were all suggesting reasons that so many people are struggling with, crime and poverty. And I said that a huge cause of this was the fact that most children in Detroit are not being raised by two parents. The professor stared at me with a blank face for a moment, and then she curled her lips into this strange, forced laugh. And then the entire lecture hall laughed at me as well. I was stunned. Why would they be laughing? This is common sense. Most people would know you'd rather be raised by your mom and your dad, not by one or neither parents. And the professor then responded, with the pithy saying of the left, "It takes a village to raise a child." That phrase has always bothered me ever since then, because I realized then and there that phrase is saying the nuclear family is irrelevant. You can have sexual liberation. You can have kids out of wedlock. It doesn't really matter how your kids are raised, because it doesn't take two parents. It takes, quote unquote, a village. And a village typically means a publicly run elementary school. I've seen flyers hung up at university that said things like, "It's not about discovering yourself, it's about creating yourself." You're not discovering who God made you to be, you're creating yourself. You are your own creator. And that is the underlying idea behind gender theory as well. You don't receive your gender, you invent it. We've seen flyers advertising a behavioral study in which gay black men with multiple sex partners as young as 13 were invited to participate in a study with their multiple sex partners to receive a $50 gift card, normalizing that, frankly, illegal behavior. Master's professors, I once was graded a 60%. So this professor knew that I was pursuing a degree in higher education and history in order to study church history. I had told him that because he asked why I wanted a master's degree, and I told him I'd like to study church history. He gave me a topic, and he told me to study basically pre-Council of Nicene Christianity, especially St. Paul's writings. And he gave me a historian to read, and this historian was very atheistic, implying that St. Paul made up all the stuff about the resurrection. It was all just a hoax that St. Paul had made up. I wrote a 30, 40-page paper summarizing this historian's work, and then at the end I offered a simple closing thoughts where I said this is not the only way of interpreting the writings of St. Paul. Many historians also, believe in divine revelation as they analyze the work of St. Paul. That simple epilogue I wrote got me a D on the paper, and when I asked why I was given such a low score, he said, quote, "No actual historian believes the resurrection story literally," end quote. So simply believing in the resurrection, he said, made you incapable of being an actual historian. Education methods courses, which I took as I am a teacher, had an implicit understanding that education was a means to equip social justice advocates rather than educating in reading, English, social studies, or history, etc. I had a social studies methods course in which day in and day out we were taught how to create children who were activists for social change, and we were never taught how to help students find absolute location on a map or understand supply and demand or any actual social studies topics. In general, in the university, Catholicism will be regarded as an agrarian institution which is not only outdated, but was a vehicle of the patriarchy and is damaging to gender relations and is damaging to mental health. That is the way Catholicism will be understood in general by most professors. This is that flyer for that disturbing behavioral research study that I mentioned a moment ago. So how can you keep your faith in the university? I'll give you a few points here, and then we'll close it up. The first thing you need to do if you're going into the university, or if a loved one is, you need to understand that your college experience is similar to battling a disease with an extremely high mortality rate. If you were faced with an aggressive cancer diagnosis and told you only had a 20% chance to survive, if you would like to survive, you would need to firmly and resolutely decide if you intended on maintaining your faith. Like if you had the cancer, you would need to firmly decide if you were going to fight to the very end to defeat this disease. or else you'd have no chance. And if you go to university without firmly deciding that you're going to keep your faith no matter what, you will lose it. You need to anticipate and prepare mentally, emotionally, spiritually for professors and classmates who will be antagonistic to your faith, even if you go to a Christian university. This will help you perceive their intellectual attacks as emerging from an intellectual foe, not from an objective beacon of truth. You need to be able to learn from your professors whatever you need to learn to get your degree. And in the natural sciences, they're going to teach a lot of just good stuff about, let's say, math or science or whatever. But you also need to understand that they will be taking jabs at your faith, and when they do so, they are not doing that from a pedestal of truth. They're doing that from a philosophically bankrupt ideology. Be aware that different majors will present different challenges. In general, liberal arts majors will have less objective standards to cover, and they will dwell much more heavily in liberal atheistic ideas. But even if you study a natural science degree, you will still have professors who will attempt to convert you to atheism, and you should be prepared for what arguments they'll make and anticipate you will have to fight to keep your faith. You need to understand the game plan of the intellectual enemies who are in charge of the university. Incoming Christians at universities should know ahead of time how professors succeed in proselytizing young Christians. Most professors establish a number of non-negotiable atheistic or at least implicitly atheistic premises, which they expect all students to operate under. For example, it would be absolutely unheard of for a student to write a paper about how sin is the cause of most mental illnesses, how divine punishment was the cause, most likely, of COVID-19, or how the expedition of Christopher Columbus had a benefit for Latin American civilizations due to the superiority of Catholicism over the demonic pagan cults which preceded Catholicism. Rigid atheistic premises can be more convincing than a well-articulated argument, because when premises are presented rather than an atheistic argument, it's presented as a simple case closed matter. So you need to be aware of what premises are atheistic that you're being taught. They're just implied, they're not really explained, because it's almost easier to accept premises unknowingly than it would be to accept an articulated atheistic argument. You must be wary of what atheistic premises your professors are making. That's the number one way people lose their faith, is by accepting so many atheistic premises without realizing it, that eventually you realize your worldview no longer makes sense, because you've accepted so many atheistic premises where theism is absurd. These are the premises which atheistic professors present. First, no religion is objectionable. They're all fine. They're all even good, except Catholicism. That's an object, that's a vehicle of the patriarchy, and it's sexually repressive. Catholicism is presented as a sexist, sexually progressive societal parasite, which clung itself to the West and did a lot of harm until the Enlightenment finally cured the West of it. You'll be taught the premise that if there is a God, he is not ever a significant enough factor in any area of sociology, psychology, history, or the natural sciences to ever warrant mentioning him. You'll be taught the premise that the Christian moral system is repressive and oppressive, and Freudian psychology, Marxist sociology, and situation ethics has taken its place. You'll be taught that there is no means of attaining objective truths. As Descartes said, all we have is subjective experience and subjective assumptions. Subjective experience should guide human decision-making, then, not an supposedly errant belief in objective truth, and assumptions about objective reality should always be doubted. That's the number one act of intellectuals today, is to get people to doubt assumptions about objective reality, which we would just say objective reality itself. Also, there is an implicit absolute value in innovation. Innovation is always good. That's assumed in the university. And so there is an implicit denigration of what is old or traditional, especially Catholicism. If you are going to keep your faith, you need to pursue a parallel education. You may not like the idea of reading more than your college professors are already assigning, but you need to continue to pursue an education that is integrated with divine revelation if you are able to recognize the errors as you're being taught them. You may not be smarter than your college professor, but that does not mean he is smarter than the Catholic tradition. Without theology as the queen of your education, you will be swept away in the currents of secular academia, which has no anchor in reality and simply sweeps away pursuing subjective experience. Theology must be the foundation of your educational journey if it is going to be worthwhile and if you're going to avoid losing your faith. College students should devour books, lectures, meaty YouTube channels, humbly, I suggest this one, and audiobooks in the Catholic theological tradition to supplement what will be lacking in your atheistic education in the university. You should seek to read Catholic or at least Christian perspectives on the subjects you are studying. You should seek to read Christian or Catholic historians, Catholic political science commentators such as Michael Knowles or Matt Walsh. You should read Catholic psychologists such as Dr. Ray Goretti. You should read from Catholic biologists and physicists in order to understand how our faith understands these disciplines. If you know any Catholic biologists, please suggest them. And I would say read the Catechism. As a young person, you should read that cover to cover to understand the systematic theology of Catholic tradition. And a good Catholic physicist would be Father Michael Spitzer. He does a lot of good stuff for providing a Catholic view of physics. Astrophysics, that is. Join a network of Catholics. Maybe this should have been number one. That's kind of up to your interpretation. Let me know what you think. Studies indicate that peers have more of an influence on adolescents in modeling acceptable behaviors and beliefs than parents. While professors have a large influence over one's intellectual formation, classmates and peers have more of an influence over one's moral formation. For many, accepting moral evils while at college, such as taking drugs or engaging in sexual acts which are morally reprehensible, weaken the intellect to the point of accepting intellectual evils and ultimately renouncing one's faith in general. As you live, so you will believe. And if you begin to accept sins as a normal part of your life, you will soon lose your faith. If all of your friends are accepting sins such as binge drinking, drugs, marijuana included, and immoral sexual acts, if you begin to hang out with those people, their attitudes towards those sins will creep in. You'll begin to appreciate those sins and not abhor them. You'll begin to do those sins, and then the worldview which condemns those sins will seem ridiculous because you will have accepted the opposite of your moral beliefs. Accepting moral evils sets the church's teachings up as an adversary to one's freedom, ultimately leading the college student to reject the church as an enemy to one's freedom. But the cure is to join a network of young Catholics who are all trying to pursue moral and intellectual truth. Doing so has the ability to inspire one to practice greater virtue and abhor popular moral evils, which would be socially ostracizing if you did not have a Catholic group of friends to associate with. So join a group of people who see sin as reprehensible rather than a group of people who see sanctity as reprehensible. Point 4. Discern your vocation heavily. College should not be the best 4 years of your life. The day in and day out living out of your vocation should be the best decades of your life. College is the ideal time for you to discern your vocation. You have less responsibilities and are thus the most easily able to, quote, sit on the fence, end quote, between vocations and be the most receptive to God's will. Discerning your vocation opens you up deeply to the church's variety of spiritual traditions, and you will become fully immersed in the spiritual tradition that most calls to you, and you will then get more out of your faith and form the lifelong bonds and appreciation for your faith, which you need to survive, through university life with your faith, and also to have a holy adult life as well. Most religious orders also have the financial means to host you for weekend come-and-sees. Some can even pay for your transportation to their facilities. So discerning your vocation can be an excellent opportunity to meet other young Catholics from around the country, if not the world. It's an ability to travel and to see different parts of the country, particularly see the religious orders which are making such a great difference throughout the country. And most importantly, going on come-and-see visits to religious orders around the country gives you the ability to visualize yourself living out a lifelong vocation of consecrated sanctity. Even if you are called to marry life, being able to visualize yourself being a member of a consecrated religious life institution will help you to perceive your married vocation, if that's what you're called to, in the light of sanctity and not worldliness. Point 5. Develop lifelong habits of prayer while you are in university life. As you begin your adult life, you must form the habits which will be the foundation of your prayer life throughout your adult life. Make sure that there is a time each day for scripture and prayer. Use masstimes.org to locate churches near your university where you can attend Holy Mass and receive reconciliation frequently. Allow the Eucharist to be the center of your life while at university. Explore the church's devotional treasury to determine which devotions might open your heart the most freely to God, with Eucharistic adoration and the Holy Rosary being given pride of place in your pursuit of what forms of prayer God is calling you to throughout your life. Okay, in this video, we examined the idea of the university and we discussed how we should all appreciate what the university could be. However, we talked about the rise of the university when it was pursuing these ideals, and we talked about how the university began to fall away from these ideals. We talked about the reality of the university in the West today, and we also discussed practical steps for maintaining one's faith while pursuing a degree in the university. Let us conclude with a prayer that all of our studies can be directed towards the glory of God. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. May God bless you, and may the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your mind anything I've said unpleasing to him or untrue. See you next time.